Good. Thank you for coming, everybody. Very good to see you all for the second Thinking Big talk of the year, and welcome to the thousands of people who are watching online as well. Very good to see you all. So I've got two titles for my talk today. The first one, which is the one that's designed to get you here, is The Great War, Chinese Beer and Tintin. But what I really want to talk about today is when was World War I? Now, this could be the shortest talk in the whole series, in fact, possibly the shortest talk in the whole of Waldingham history, because we all know the answer to this, don't we? We know that World War I was from 1914 to 1918. Just a few weeks ago, we were remembering that moment when the guns fell silent, 11 o'clock, the 11th of November, 1918. There is no doubt about it. That is when World War I was. Or was it? Well, what about this war memorial? Did they just get it wrong? 1914 to 1919. And what about this commemorative book, which also says 1914 to 1919? Or this medal from Canada for those who'd served in the war, 1914 to 1919. And one more, another commemorative medal, also commemorating the Great War, 1914 to 1919. Why is it that all of these medals, books, war memorials are talking about a completely different date? Well, the answer, of course, is because the Great Peace Treaty at the end of the war, Treaty of Versailles, was signed in 1919. What we had in 1918 was the armistice, the ceasefire, but the war only officially came to an end when the peace treaty itself was signed. So, 1914 to 1918? Perhaps not. Perhaps 1914 to 1919. But there's a problem there. And the problem is that there wasn't just one peace treaty at the end of World War I. If you go to Hungary, even today, there is still a great deal of resentment and anger about the peace treaty at Trianon, which ended the war with Austria-Hungary. And that wasn't signed in 1919. That was signed in 1920. So the Great War, 1914 to 1920. Or perhaps not. There are also treaties with other countries as well, notably Turkey. And Turkey, the Ottoman Empire as it was, had a peace treaty, and then there was a great revolution in Turkey, and Kemal Ataturk came to power, and so they had another peace treaty, and that was signed in 1923. So the Great War, 1914 to 1923. That's cleared it up, sorted. Now, you may be thinking, actually, look, Mr. Peachy, you're just quibbling here. You're just playing around with semantics. We all know that the fighting stopped in 1918. That's when the dying ended. Well, maybe. But I'd like to take you to France. And I'd like to take you in particular to a little village called Noyelles-sur-Mer, which is at the mouth of the Somme, long way away from any of the fighting. It's a tiny little village, nothing really there very much at all, apart from one First World War cemetery, in which there are 841 graves. Now, what on earth were all these people doing buried in this tiny little French village? Well, the answer is that this was the headquarters of the Chinese Labour Corps during World War I. And the graves here are for labourers, Chinese labourers, who died during the war. So when I visited this particular cemetery, I did what you do when you go to these cemeteries. I wandered up and down the aisles. It's a very moving experience. But after a while, it's difficult to know what to do next. You don't want to leave too quickly, but you've thought about those who've died, you've said a prayer for those who've died. What do you do then? Well, I thought I'd go and have a look and see if I could find someone who died right at the end of the war. And lo and behold, I found it. Here is a grave of a poor labourer who died on November the 11th, 1918. How unlucky can you get? Well, turns out you can get quite a lot more unlucky, because I looked at the next gravestone, November the 12th, 1918. The war was over by then. This poor guy died. And then I walked further and further and further, and up the next row, and up the next row, and up the next row, until eventually I came to this gravestone, March the 23rd, 1920. Over half of the graves in this particular cemetery commemorated people who had died after the cessation of hostilities, after the war had ended. Now, what on earth is going on there? Why is it that so many people were dying between 1918 and 1920? And it's not just that cemetery. Here's another Chinese cemetery at St. Etienne-au-Mont, which is just outside Boulogne. Now, this tells you two things. Number one, tells you that I have an extremely tolerant wife who lets me break off from family holidays to go and explore Chinese cemeteries. And number two, it tells us that here, yet again, 160 graves in this one, almost exactly half of those were of people who died after the war finished. Okay, something's going on. Now, in order to explain what's going on, I need to take you on another journey, and I'm going to take you to China itself. And specifically, I'm going to take you to Qingdao. Qingdao, as you can see up there, is on the coast. It's where the sailing happened at the Beijing Olympics back in 2008. And this is what it looks like today. It's a thriving, typical Chinese city, kind of built on the American model. Lots of modern buildings, but one or two strange anomalies. And the strange anomaly I particularly want to draw your attention to is the church up there. It looks like a very European church. In fact, it looks like a very German church. And that's precisely what it was. Because in the run-up to World War I, various parts of China, Chinese ports, had been taken over by foreign powers. Hong Kong, taken over by the British, Shanghai, divvied up between the British, the French, Americans, and Qingdao had been taken by the Germans. Now, we know this. There are various, awful legacies of that imperial order, that imperial era, but one or two beneficial elements as well. So what did the Germans leave behind? Well, they left beer. Yes, I promised you Chinese beer, and here it is. Qingdao beer is a very well-known Chinese beer. And I leave no stone unturned in pursuit of your education. So I paid a little fact-finding tour to Qingdao and visited this brewery on your behalf. And I can tell you that it is fine beer indeed. But it was left there by the Germans. The Germans, great brewers, the Chinese took it over eventually, and there's Qingdao beer still being sold to this day. Now, what happened at the start of World War I was that the Japanese thought, okay, here's an opportunity for us to get some territory in China. So the Japanese, with a bit of help from the British, attacked Qingdao and booted the Germans out. And not unreasonably, the Chinese thought after that, okay, great, we've got our city back, but actually the Japanese held on to it. And so the Chinese thought, okay, we've got to put some pressure on the Allies here to try and get our city back. So first of all, they offered troops, and the Allies turned down Chinese troops, essentially for racist reasons. Clearly, there was a need for troops on the Western Front, lots of people dying at the Somme and elsewhere, but that offer was turned down. So eventually, the Chinese government came up with another offer, which was for labourers. And there were clearly a need for labourers as well. So that offer was eventually taken by the French and the British. And from 1917 onwards, lots and lots of labourers, 150,000 approximately, ended up in Western Europe, doing things like building railways, manning the ports, mending tanks. All sorts of different bits of work were done by these Chinese labourers. And 1917 was also when the Chinese declared war on Germany. So for the Chinese, when did World War I start? Was it 1914 when Qingdao was attacked? Was it 1917 when they declared war officially? It's complicated. It's more complicated than we might think. And then when does the war end? Well, we get to 1919, we get to the Great Peace Treaty at Versailles, and the Chinese delegation was led by this guy, a fine-looking fellow, Lu Zhengxiang, one of my heroes. And he led the delegation, And it became clear after a while that the Chinese were not going to get Qingdao back. And so he was put under enormous pressure, both at home and at the peace conference, to sign the treaty. And he refused. He was the only person. China was the only country to refuse to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Absolutely staggering decision, and a very brave one indeed. So we've got a real issue here. When is World War I for the Chinese? Well, is it 1914? Is it 1917? Does it end in 1923? Does it end in 1919? It's really not that clear. So what we need to think about is perhaps not history from the top down, but history from the bottom up. What is people's experience of war? If I can give a family example, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, I should say, went to fight in World War I, and he was gassed in 1915, but survived. And he survived to the end of the war, but actually his lungs were permanently shot away by this. And eventually he died in 1929, but he died of the injuries he'd received in that war. He doesn't appear on any war memorial, but he was as much a victim of the war as Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, any of the other people you might care to name. So his experience of war was one which continued for another 10 years after the war's ending. And then, of course, there was the Spanish flu, so-called, not Spanish at all. It was just that the Spanish didn't have quite as many controls on their press as other countries. And so while other countries suppressed news of the flu, the Spanish talked about it and wrote about it, and so it became known as the Spanish flu. Millions of people died after World War I of the Spanish flu as a direct result of what had been happening during the war. So for any of these guys, the war didn't finish in 1918. It certainly didn't finish in 1919 either. It lingered. It continued. And we might want to think about how the war continued in other ways too. So the greatest poet, arguably, of World War I is a man called David Jones. Now, you may not have come across him because his poetry is difficult. Brilliant, but difficult. If you have come across him, perhaps you've more likely come across him as an artist. So he was a very good artist. His art can be found in galleries like the Tate and elsewhere. But he wrote this book in parenthesis about the war, but it was only published in 1937, really quite late, just as everybody's minds were beginning to turn to World War II. And it's, in a sense, what happened there was that he was taking a while really to process everything that had happened to him. And it took those years of fermentation almost before he was able to produce this masterpiece, which came out in 1937. So when was World War I? Maybe World War I hadn't finished. Maybe World War I continued throughout the 20s, throughout the 30s, in the experiences of individuals, in the experiences of those who'd fought in the war, in the experiences of those who had been left at home. And there's a really interesting book by an American historian called Paul Fussell, called The Great War and Modern Memory. And he argues that the First World War became so embedded in the modern memory that it continued throughout the 20th century in one sense. So he talks about some very specific changes that came about because of the war that are still with us to this day, actually. So like daylight saving time, British summertime, started with World War I. What he calls a trench fad of wearing a watch on your wrist, that started with World War I. Paper money, banknotes replacing gold coins, again started because of World War I. But more than that, he says that the whole way in which we regard the past, in which we think about the past, has been moulded, has been shaped by World War I. It has become an intrinsic part of modern memory. And in particular, we've been shaped by the literature of World War I. It's a fascinating book. I really recommend it. There are one or two flaws with it. It was written in 1975 and ideas have changed a little bit since then. So one critic has said that he misses out what he calls the colour of memory, which I think is a very interesting idea. Paul Fussell writes mainly about English writers, British writers, a few Americans as well, but certainly not about the World War, the whole of the world. So that's one reason why I like this book, The Lost Voices of World War I. It begins to give you a more international picture. You come across Bulgarian writers, Armenian writers, very interesting. But even this book is a little bit thin on some areas we might be wanting to consider. So I've talked here in school before about what happened in Africa and what happened, what was the Indian experience of war. So the first shot of World War I, for example, wasn't fired in Europe at all, it was fired in Africa, which is rather surprising. But today I'm going to focus on China, just because of the lack of time. And I want to take you back to this picture that I showed you a little while ago. And this strange memorial on the left. And this is the May the 4th memorial, which has nothing to do with Star Wars. I imagine it means very little to most of you here. But in China, everybody would know what is meant by May the 4th. And what happened on May the 4th, 1919, was that news of the betrayal at Versailles, as they saw it, came through. The news that China was not going to get its territory back. And this provoked a huge wave of protests across China. And those protests then developed into a political and cultural movement which was hugely significant, really transformed the Chinese political scene, the literary scene, the cultural scene, dominated the 20th century. So even today there are films like this one, My 1919. Okay, for the Chinese modern memory, it is 1919 that matters, not 1918. It's what happened at Versailles, or what didn't happen at Versailles, that really has shaped the modern Chinese imagination. And so last year, the 100th anniversary of May the 4th, there were huge parades, celebrations all across China. And again, that really didn't feature in the British news at all. Okay, there's another book I need to mention. It's mine! Oh yes, I would be remiss in not mentioning my own novel. So here we are, Between Darkness and Light. And what I wanted to do when I was writing this novel was to challenge the chronology of the war. So I have three sections to this book, 1900, 1917 and 1919. I deliberately didn't have a section on 1914 or 18 because I was trying to look at the war from a Chinese perspective. I was trying to look at it with fresh eyes. So in my novel, there is no fighting, or at least there are no battles. It's a war novel with no fighting in it. In my novel, the deaths that occur, and there are deaths that occur, happen after 1919. I'm deliberately setting out to challenge the narrative and the chronology that we perhaps all grow up with. Okay, time is pressing, so I'm just going to return to this fine fellow because I've promised you Tintin, and we're going to get on to Tintin in a second. So Liu Zhengxiang, unsuccessful at the Treaty of Versailles, went back to China, became Prime Minister of China for a bit, Foreign Minister for a bit, and then his wife got very ill. And so he retired from frontline politics and he moved to Switzerland, hoping that the air would help her recover. And he became ambassador to the League of Nations, ambassador to Switzerland, and sadly his wife died. And he had converted to Catholicism, his wife's religion. She was from Belgium. It was a mixed race marriage, very, very unusual for that time. And as an act of devotion to her, he promised her that he would become a monk, a Benedictine monk, a Catholic monk. And here he is again, same chap. And he became a monk in Belgium, in a Benedictine monastery, went from being Prime Minister of China to a priest, and he lived a life of almost total obscurity in Belgium for many years. But he did befriend people. One of the people he befriended was Hergé, creator of the Tintin books. And when Hergé started to get interested in China, and wrote about it in this wonderful book, The Blue Lotus, which I highly recommend, do go and read my novel, but also read Tintin. It's very, very good. When Hergé started to get interested in China, he spoke to Liu Zhengxiang, or Dom Pierre Celestine as he'd become, and the monk, former Prime Minister, lent him books, talked to him about the situation in China. So when he eventually produced this book, it is actually very authentic. He worked with a Chinese artist who made his way into the story itself as Chang, and this is all very accurate here. But it's also politically very clued up. So there's a whole section towards the end of the Blue Lotus where the events of the late 1930s are dealt with in explicit detail. Hergé moved away from politics, actually, because of the events of World War II after this book. But this one is very, very politically astute. In fact, there were diplomatic protests because of what he wrote in this book. And a lot of this was coming from Liu Zhengxiang and his experiences of the betrayal at the end of World War I. So World War I continues to linger, and it influences all sorts of things, even comic books. So, I promised I would finish in order for you to get to lunch, and I would do that. But I want to just leave you with a final question, because one of the things we're trying to do with these talks, is not just to have a talk and then you forget about it, but something you can follow up. So my question to you is, if it's not as straightforward to date World War I, if it's not necessarily as straightforward as 1914 to 1918, if in a sense World War I continues to this day, when was World War II? And if you want to consider that question, you might want to start with this great novel, Empire of the Sun by J.G. Ballard, which sets out to complicate the chronology of World War II. It is also a movie. Steven Spielberg produced a great movie of it, so you can I commend that to you as well. And it might just get you thinking this very simple question. And I think one of the things that comes through these Thinking Big talks is that if we ask simple questions of complex topics, we'll come up with some really interesting answers. And just one last thing to say. I've talked a little bit about Japan and the problems that Japan caused for China. I also could recommend another book by a very, very great Japanese writer, Takashi Nagai, who wrote a book called The Bells of Nagasaki, which again might fit in rather neatly with this one. I'll send out a follow-up sheet after this lecture, and you might want to follow up on some or all of the things that I've mentioned today. But thank you very much for listening. Okay, if anybody would like to ask any questions, feel free to stay. If you want to go and get lunch, that's fine. If any of you want to talk to me about giving a talk, I know some of you have contacted me already and want a quick chat now, please do that. Or if you want to come speak